In April of 1971, a 30-second commercial began airing on American television. By the end of the decade, it would become one of the most aired public service announcements in the history of broadcasting. Television stations would wear out their copies of it and request replacements from the Ad Council. It won 2 Clio Awards, and it would give an entire generation of Americans the image of a Native American they would carry around in their heads for the rest of their lives. The ad opens on a man paddling a canoe down a river. Black braids, buckskin, and a single feather. The narration is from radio and TV legend William Conrad, slow and resonant. The man paddles past a smoking factory. He pulls his canoe onto a shore strewn with trash. He walks toward a freeway and he stands there. A passing motorist hurls a bag of garbage out the window of a car which lands at his feet. The camera pushes in on his face and a single tear rolls down his cheek. The voiceover says, "Some people have a deep abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country, and some people don't." The teardrop was made of glycerin, a drop of it placed by a makeup artist between takes. The ad was produced by an agency called Marsteller, the visual arm of Burst and Marsteller, a public relations firm whose specialty at the time was representing corporate clients with environmental problems. The campaign was paid for by an organization called Keep America Beautiful, which was founded in 1953 by the American Can Company and the Owens, Illinois Glass Company. By 1971, its members also included Coca-Cola and the Dixie Cup Company. Keep America Beautiful was a trade association for companies whose disposable packaging was filling American landfills. The point of the campaign was to convince American consumers that pollution was the fault of individual litterers, rather than an industry that had spent the 2 previous decades transitioning the country from refillable glass bottles to disposable cans and cups. The Crying Indian ad was, by design, an act of public relations on behalf of the people who made the cans the Indian was supposed to be sad about. The man in the canoe was perfect for what the ad needed. He looked the part. He was credited as Iron Eyes Cody. He'd been working in Hollywood for nearly half a century by then, since the late silent era, and by 1971 was the most employed real Indian in Hollywood history. He appeared in over 200 films, playing Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and a long line of generic chiefs in westerns starring John Wayne, Steve McQueen, Gene Autry, and Richard Harris. He married a native woman, an archaeologist named Bertha Parker. He also adopted 2 native sons. He served on the board of the Los Angeles Indian Center. Depending on the year and the interview, he claimed to be Cherokee, Cree, or both, born in Oklahoma in 1907. He had been born in 1904 in a small town called Kaplan in Vermilion Parish in southwestern Louisiana. His parents were Antonio de Corti, an immigrant from southern Italy, and Francesca Salpietra, an immigrant from Sicily. They ran a grocery store in the nearby town of Gaydon. The man in the canoe was their second son. His given name was Aspera Oscar de Corti. Aspera was baptized at the Holy Rosary Catholic Church in Kaplan. He wasn't Cherokee or Cree, and he wasn't Native American by any definition, but he had been playing the part for 67 years. I'm Lorne Bregitzer, a professor at the University of Colorado Denver's College of Arts and Media, and on Everything is Gray, we try to make sense of something that's rarely simple, how the artists we admire and the things they've done shape the way we see their work and ourselves. This is the story of how Hollywood spent 100 years teaching America what a Native American was supposed to look like, by paying people who weren't Native Americans to play the part. It's the story of one man at the center of that practice, who became the most famous Indian in America while being somewhere else entirely. It's the story of a woman he married, whose actual achievements in Native American scholarship were quietly erased while he collected the awards. It's the story of the man who came before him, who paid for the deception with his life, and the people who came after, who are still being paid for it. And it's the story of how the system that produced Iron Eyes Cody didn't end when he died. Aspera Oscar de Corti. The story begins in a small town in Louisiana in 1904, where the locals weren't entirely sure what to do with a family of Sicilians. Kaplan, in Vermilion Parish, was a town of farmers and oilmen on the Cajun Prairie. It was Catholic, French-speaking, rural, and not especially welcoming to immigrants who weren't already part of the existing French-speaking population. Antonio de Corti had come from southern Italy. Francesca Salpietra had come from Sicily. They were dark-skinned, Catholic, foreign, and poor. The Italian immigrants who came to the American South in the 1890s and 1900s landed in a country that didn't know exactly how to classify them. In Louisiana in 1891, 11 Italian immigrants had been lynched in New Orleans in what remains the largest mass lynching in American history. The official charge against them was the murder of the New Orleans police chief, a charge for which a jury had already acquitted 6 of them and declared a mistrial on the other 3. A mob broke into the prison and killed them anyway. The future president Theodore Roosevelt called it, in a letter to his sister, a rather good thing. The Italians in the Jim Crow South of the 1890s were not black, but they weren't entirely white either. They worked the same jobs the black laborers worked. They lived in the neighborhoods black families lived in. They occasionally married across the color line. In Louisiana in 1904, the question of where Sicilians fit in the racial order hadn't been settled. Aspera Oscar de Corti was born into that uncertainty on April 3, 1904. His parents ran the grocery store in Gaydon. He was their second son, with an older brother named Joseph, a younger sister named Victoria, and a younger brother named Frank. His half-sister, May Abshire, would tell a reporter nearly a century later that even as a child, Aspera dressed up as an Indian and led the neighborhood boys in outdoor games. He always wanted to be an Indian, she told a journalist in 1996. If he could find something that looked Indian, he'd put it on. There's a lot in that one line. A boy in a Louisiana town that hasn't decided whether his family counts as white or not, finding one available identity around him that has its own myth, its own dignity, its own visual language, and putting it on. The myth was already in place. Wild West shows had been touring the country since the 1880s. The Buffalo Bill version of the American Indian, half noble and half savage, was a version that filled boys' imaginations, dime store novels, and traveling shows. Aspera was a child who wasn't quite white, in a town that didn't quite want him. He reached for the costume that the country had been telling him was the most authentic and more spiritual identity than his own. By the time he became a teenager, the costume he'd been playing dress-up in was about to become his paying job. Somewhere in the early 1910s, Antonio left the family and took work in the oil refineries around Houston. His marriage broke up. Francesca stayed in Gaydon with their younger children. Antonio took the 3 older boys with him to Texas, changed his name to Tony Corti, and worked the rest of his life as a pool room manager. He died in 1924 at the age of 45, before any of his sons had really gotten started. What happened next is the part of the story Iron Eyes Cody told differently every time he was asked. In the 1930s, he said he had grown up Cherokee in Oklahoma. In the 1950s, he said his father had been Cherokee and his mother had been Cree. His 1982 ghost-written autobiography offered a third version that didn't match either of those. What is actually documented is this. In 1924, after their father died, the 3 brothers left Texas for California. They changed their last name from Corti to Cody. Aspera began calling himself Tony Cody, and then Iron Eyes Cody. He took bit parts in the silent westerns that were the working stock of Los Angeles in the 1920s, because westerns needed Indians. Westerns also had no particular interest in confirming that anyone playing an Indian was actually an Indian. A young man with dark hair and a Mediterranean face who could ride a horse fit the bill. In 1924 Hollywood, that was close enough. He did the job for the next 73 years. Hollywood's redface. Iron Eyes Cody was building his career inside a rule the studios had been following for decades. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the rule was simple. Indians could be in westerns. Indians could not be cast as the lead roles in westerns. If the part was important, the studio would put a white man in it with a wig and brown makeup and call him an Indian. This wasn't a hidden practice, it was the default. The list of major Hollywood films in which a non-native actor played a native lead from the silent era through the 1960s is essentially the list of major Hollywood films about native people. Jeff Chandler played Cochise in Broken Arrow in 1950, opposite a real Mohawk actor named Jay Silverheels, who got second billing as Geronimo. Burt Lancaster played the Apache warrior Maasai in Apache in 1954, with his eyes actually taped to look more almond-shaped. Rock Hudson played a Plains Indian called Young Bull in Winchester 73 in 1950. Charles Bronson, Anthony Quinn, Robert Blake, and Charlton Heston all played native characters in serious studio films, and none of them were native. The justification was always the same. The studios said they were casting the best actor for the part. They said there weren't enough native actors with a screen presence to carry a major picture. They said audiences wouldn't accept an unknown native lead. The reasoning circled back on itself. Native actors couldn't carry pictures because they weren't being cast in them, and they weren't being cast in them because the studios said they couldn't carry the films. The native actors who did get work got the parts that came after the lead. Jay Silverheels had a real career, playing Tonto in the Lone Ranger television series for almost a decade. Chief Dan George got nominated for an Academy Award in 1971 for Little Big Man. Will Sampson played Chief Bromden in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975. But these were exceptions. Most of them came late in the studio era, and to land those parts, the actors had to walk past a long line of white men in grease paint. This was the working environment in which Iron Eyes Cody was operating. He definitely wasn't the worst thing in it. He was, in some ways, a beneficiary of a system that was even more aggressive in its exclusion than he himself was, and the comparison is part of why his story is harder to handle than it first appears. Cody was, at the very least, willing to commit to the part. He didn't take the role for a single film and then go back to being Tony Cody. He held the part for 60 years, every day, in his home and in his community and in his marriage. He stayed in the part long after the studio leads who showed up for a 6-week shoot took off the makeup and went home. He was also sometimes hired to advise on the makeup and the costuming for the films where lead actors were white men playing Indians. This is all well documented. The studios would put Burt Lancaster in grease paint, and they would pay Iron Eyes Cody to make sure Burt Lancaster's grease paint looked right. The studios were paying a Sicilian American playing Indian to authenticate a white actor playing Indian, while the actual native performers who could have played either part were waiting outside in the line of extras. The work. For a sense of how thoroughly Iron Eyes Cody worked inside the studio system, here's a partial accounting. His first credited film role was The Big Trail in 1930, a John Wayne Western. He was 26 years old, and the work didn't stop. He appeared in The Plainsman with Gary Cooper in 1936. He played Crazy Horse in Sitting Bull in 1954, opposite the Irish-American actor J. Carroll Naish playing Sitting Bull. He appeared in The Searchers with John Wayne in 1956. He played opposite Steve McQueen in Nevada Smith in 1966, and opposite Richard Harris in A Man Called Horse in 1970. He was even in Ernest Goes to Camp in 1987. In the 1950s, he and Bertha hosted a television show on KTLA in Los Angeles about Native American history and folklore. He served on the boards of multiple Native American organizations. The Hollywood Walk of Fame even gave him a star in 1983. He kept living the part outside of work. He wore his hair in 2 braids when out in public. He attended powwows and ceremonies. He gave to Native causes. He was a fixture at the Los Angeles Indian Center, the gathering place established in the 1950s for Native Americans who had been brought to Los Angeles under the federal government's urban relocation program. The relocation program is its own story, and not a generous one. But the Indian Center was a genuine refuge for the families it brought together, and the Codys were part of building it. In 1995, the Native American community in Hollywood gave him a Lifetime Achievement Honor. They knew by then what the rest of the public didn't. The honor was specifically and openly given to him as a non-Native person who had spent decades supporting Native causes. The phrasing was deliberate. The community had decided to honor what he had done while still being clear about who he was. They worked out the terms of that in private. The rest of the country never saw any of it. A year later, an article by a postdoctoral scholar at UCLA appeared in a New Orleans newspaper, but we'll get back to that. Buffalo Child Long Lance. To put the Cody story in perspective, it helps to look at the man who came before him. His name was Sylvester Clark Long, and he was born on December 1st, 1890 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. His parents were Joe Long and Sally Carson Long. His father had actually worked as a slave as a child. His mother had documented indigenous ancestry on the Croatan or Lumbee side. His father, depending on which family account you trust, had Cherokee ancestry as well. The Longs were classified under the racial categories of the late 19th century North Carolina as colored. That word in 1890 Winston-Salem meant black. It also meant Jim Crow. It meant a son who would be barred from white schools, white restaurants, white workplaces, and white futures. The fact that the Longs had mixed indigenous ancestry, which they did, wasn't a category the South of 1890 had any interest in recognizing. But Sylvester had a face the country could read in more than one way. High cheekbones, straight black hair, and skin tone that could be cast, depending on who was looking, as one thing or another. At 13, he ran away from Winston-Salem and joined a Wild West show, where he learned something about the country he lived in. Away from home, when he carried himself a certain way and wore certain clothes, he passed for Indian. And an Indian in 1903 America had more legal and social rights than a non-white boy from North Carolina had any right to expect. He started teaching himself Cherokee from one of the Indian performers in the show. He returned to Winston-Salem in 1909 at the age of 19 with a plan. He would apply to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the most famous native boarding school in the country. He would present himself as half Cherokee on his father's side and half Croatan on his mother's. He would speak the Cherokee he learned. He would gamble that no one would actually check, and no one did check. He was admitted to Carlisle in the fall of 1909. He was 19 years old, though he lied about his age and was listed as 15, which gave him a longer educational runway. He graduated in 1912 the same class as Jim Thorpe, who that year would become the most famous Native American athlete in the world after winning gold medals in the pentathlon and decathlon at the Stockholm Olympics. Long was also in the same class as Robert Geronimo, the son of the famed Apache leader. Sylvester excelled both academically and athletically, which earned him a scholarship to Conway Hall, the prep school of Dickinson College, and from there to St. John's Military Academy in Manlius, New York. He was now Sylvester Longlance, the Indianized version of his name. To his classmates, he was known as Chief. When the First World War broke out and the United States stayed neutral, Longlance went north to Canada and enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He served in France. He was wounded in the summer of 1917. Sylvester came out of the war in 1919 and asked to be discharged in Calgary, where he became a reporter for the Calgary Herald and then for other Western Canadian newspapers. He wrote about indigenous communities in Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and Manitoba. And he was good. By the testimony of the editors who hired him, he was one of the best feature reporters in Western Canada during the early 1920s. In 1922, the Kainai, or Blood Nation, in southern Alberta adopted him as a relative and gave him the name Buffalo Child. That adoption was a real thing. It was performed by elders and honored by the community. He was considered by the Kainai to be kin. he was also still passing for Blackfoot, an entirely different and unrelated identity. The Kainai were a member nation of the Blackfoot Confederacy, but the slippage from one identity to the other was something he dealt with by not dealing with it at all. He was now Chief Buffalo Child Longlands, and he wrote under that name for the rest of his career. In 1928, his autobiography came out. It was called Longlands. It was the story of a Blackfoot boy growing up on the northern plains in the last years before the buffalo were gone. It was supposed to be a novel. His publisher insisted on releasing it as an autobiography. The reviews were enthusiastic. The anthropologist Paul Radin called it an unusually faithful account of childhood and early manhood. The Book of the Month Club picked it up. He was suddenly one of the most celebrated native voices in North America. In 1929, he was cast in his first and only film, The Silent Enemy, a feature about Ojibwe in the years before European contact. The publicity called him the first 100% real Indian actor in Hollywood history. While the film was in production, doubts began to circulate. The studio actually quietly hired an investigator. The investigation concluded that Longlands wasn't who he said he was, that he wasn't Blackfoot, but he'd been born in Winston-Salem to a family classified as colored. The studio didn't publicize their findings. The film was released in 1930 with Longlands in the lead, and the truth sat in a file somewhere. Sylvester moved to California in the early 1930s and lived for a time at the Arcadia estate of the silent film star Anita Baldwin. By then, he was drinking heavily. He was also suffering from depression. He understood by the early months of 1932 that the story was about to come out. On March 20th of that year, in his bedroom at the Baldwin estate, he shot and killed himself. He was only 41 years old. The cleanest version of the Longlands story will be that he was a black man who pretended to be native to escape Jim Crow, and that the pretense killed him when it was about to be exposed. That version is mostly true, but it leaves out the parts that don't fit. He did have documented indigenous ancestry on his mother's side, and possibly his father's. He was adopted by an actual native nation as actual kin. He served native communities as a journalist with real reliability and care for years. His work on First Nation issues in Canada in the 1920s was advocacy. He was also a fraud who took up space that should have belonged to actual Blackfoot people. The country he was running from had built a racial system that left him no good place to stand, so he chose a place that wasn't his, and both of those things killed him. He was the man who came before Iron Eyes Cody. He should have been a warning, and Cody never read it. Bertha Parker. The cost of what Iron Eyes Cody did is most visible in the woman he married. Her name was Bertha Parker. She was born in 1907 in Chautauqua County, New York. Her father was Arthur C. Parker, an archaeologist and the first president of the Society for American Archaeology. Her mother was Beulah Tahamont, an actress of Abenaki descent who had performed in Wild West shows in the late 19th century. Bertha grew up at archaeological digs, helping her father in the field as a small child. As a teenager, she and her mother performed in a Pocahontas show with the Ringley Brothers and Barnum Bailey Circus. She was Seneca on her father's side and Abenaki on her mother's. She didn't have a college degree, she didn't have any of the institutional credentials her colleagues had, but she had grown up doing the work, and her uncle, the archaeologist Mark Raymond Harrington, hired her in the late 1920s, first as a camp cook and expedition secretary, and then increasingly as a working archaeologist. She wound up making discoveries. In 1929, working alone at a site in Nevada she called Scorpion Hill, she conducted a solo excavation of a Pueblo site at a level of skill that astonished the trained archaeologist who reviewed her findings. The next year at Gypsum Cave in Nevada, she helped identify some of the earliest evidence of human presence in North America. The artifacts she helped pull from the cave were among the first in the country to suggest that humans had been living on this continent much longer than the field had previously assumed. That find rewrote part of the timeline of the Americas, and she was only 22 years old at the time. She became published. Between 1933 and 1942, she put out a steady stream of articles in the journal Master Key, the publication of the Southwest Museum in Los Angeles. She wrote about Maidu shamans. She wrote about Yurok customs. She wrote about California Indian baby cradles. She's widely considered to have been the first Native American woman to work professionally as an archaeologist in the United States, and she did it without ever holding a faculty position or a doctorate, just on the strength of her work alone. In 1936, she married Iron Eyes Cody. He was her third husband. Her first, Joseph, had died in the late 1920s. Her second, James Thurston, a Canadian paleontologist, had died of illness in 1932. She had a 17-year-old daughter from her first marriage, Wilma May, who was called Billy. In 1942, Billy was visiting her grandmother's farm and died of an accidental gunshot wound. Bertha was 35 years old at the time. She and Iron Eyes wound up adopting two sons, Robert Tree Cody and Arthur William Cody. Their marriage lasted until her death in 1978. By the time she died, her career was effectively invisible. Her published work was filed away in old issues of a museum journal that hardly anyone read. The husband she had married had become one of the most famous Indians in America. The wife, who was actually native, who had actually done the scholarship, who had actually made discoveries, was known in her later years by the title that appears on her gravestone in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. The gravestone reads, Mrs. Iron Eyes Cody. That's what's on it. Not her name, not her nation, not her work, just the title of being his wife. the Society for American Archaeology eventually created an award in her name, the Bertha Parker Cody Award for Native American Women, given to Indigenous women working in archaeology and museum studies. The award was created in the 21st century. The recognition came 40 years after she was dead and almost 100 years after she walked alone into a Pueblo site in southern Nevada with a notebook and a trowel and started to dig. The man whose gravestone shares a plot with hers was a Sicilian grocer's son who put on a wig. The Tier. By 1971, the studio western was finished. Television had killed the theatrical western. The cultural appetite for John Wayne and his cowboys had collapsed into nostalgia. Iron Eyes Cody, now 67 years old, was working when he could find work, which was less and less often. The world that needed his services was disappearing. The Crying Indian ad changed that. By the middle of the decade, he was the most recognizable Indian in America. Not the most recognizable Indian actor, the most recognizable Indian. People who couldn't name a native leader, a native author, a native musician, or a native politician could conjure his face on demand. He showed up at parades, at award ceremonies, and at school assemblies. He toured the country and gave speeches about the environment. He was photographed with Boy Scouts and with Miss Teenage America. His tear, that single drop of glycerin between takes, became one of the defining cultural images of the decade. There's a story to tell about the ad that doesn't get told often enough, because the story is uncomfortable for almost everyone involved. The ad's emotional power depends on a particular fantasy about Native Americans. The fantasy is that the Indian is the original, pre-contact, pre-industrial inhabitant of the continent, the figure for whom the land was sacred and unbroken, and what white American had done to the land would naturally cause that figure to weep. This is the mythologized Indian figure, the Indian who lived in harmony with nature, the Indian who is no longer here, but whose ghost could be summoned to shame the present generation into picking up its trash, the Indian who doesn't show up to a city council meeting or file an environmental lawsuit or run for office, the Indian who was a feeling rather than a person, available to be summoned, never available to talk back. In 1971, while the Crying Indian was crying on TV sets across America, actual Native activists were occupying Alcatraz Island. The occupation by the group Indians of All Tribes lasted from November 1969 until June 1971. The occupiers were calling attention to broken treaties, land rights, and federal Indian policy. They were demanding that the government honor its legal obligations. They were a real political movement with real demands made by actual Native people, and the country was choosing not to listen to any of it. What the cultural moment was choosing to listen to was a fake Indian, played by a Sicilian American, weaving silently into a commercial paid for by Coca-Cola. That contrast wasn't an accident. The historian Finis Dunaway has written about this. The Crying Indian was, in part, a cultural response designed to replace the politically inconvenient real Indian with a politically convenient symbolic one. The real Indian was Alcatraz, demanding restoration of their land. The symbolic Indian was on television, asking you to recycle. One of them had specific claims that the government and the corporations didn't want to hear. The other was a tear on a face. It's also worth noting that the ad's pollution message was a lie about what was actually causing pollution. The producers of single-use packaging, the companies funding Keep America Beautiful, were the actual source of the trash on the side of the road. Vermont had tried in 1953 to pass a law requiring deposits on disposable beverage containers. The American Can Company and the Owens Illinois Glass Company responded by founding Keep America Beautiful, which then spent the next several decades arguing publicly that pollution was the fault of individual consumers and not the manufacturers who transitioned the country away from refillable bottles in the first place. The Crying Indian was the most effective ad in that long campaign, and it worked. By the late 1970s, polls showed that more Americans considered Keep America Beautiful the most credible environmental organization in the country, ahead of the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and the Environmental Defense Fund. People had been so moved by that tear that they handed their belief in their volunteer time to the trade organization for the soda industry. This is the cultural object Iron Eyes Cody had become by 1971. He was the face of a lie about pollution, performed inside a costume that was itself a lie about who he was, paid for by the companies that were causing the problem the ad was supposedly mourning. Iron Eyes Cody carried the costume so well that for an entire generation of Americans, when they pictured a Native American, they pictured him. The 1973 Oscars. 2 years after The Crying Indian first aired, on the night of March 27, 1973, the 45th Academy Awards were held at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles. Marlon Brando was nominated for Best Actor for The Godfather. He let it be known in advance that he wouldn't attend. When his name was called as the winner, a young woman in a buckskin dress walked to the stage. She introduced herself as Sasheen Littlefeather, and she said she was Apache. She declined the Oscar on Brando's behalf, citing his protest against Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans and the ongoing standoff at Wounded Knee, where members of the American Indian movement had occupied the South Dakota Reserve site for several weeks in what had become an armed siege. She wound up speaking for about a minute. Roger Moore stood beside her, holding Brando's unaccepted Oscar. The reaction was immediate. There was applause. There was also loud and deliberate booing. There was also John Wayne in the wings, who reportedly had to be physically restrained from coming onto the stage. Then there was Clint Eastwood, presenting the next award, joking that he would like to give it on behalf of all the cowboys shot in John Ford westerns. There was also a national news cycle. There was a sustained period of professional retaliation that, by Little Feather's own later account, ended her career in Hollywood. The moment itself was real, and the moment mattered. For many Americans watching at home, it was the first time a Native person had spoken on primetime television about how Native people were treated in the film industry. Whatever the arguments about what happened at the awards show, that fact remains. A woman in a buckskin dress stood at the most watched podium in American entertainment and said, in front of 75 million viewers, things that the movie industry was trying to avoid. In 2022, the Academy issued a formal apology to Little Feather for the treatment she received in 1973. She accepted the apology in person at a public event in Los Angeles. At the time, she was 75 years old and dying from breast cancer. She died at her home in Marin County on October 2, 2022. 3 weeks after her death, the journalist Jacqueline Keeler published a piece in the San Francisco Chronicle. The piece alleged, based on interviews with Little Feather's two sisters, that Little Feather wasn't Apache. The sisters, Rosalind Cruz and Trudy Orlandi, said the family was Mexican-American and Spanish, and that their father, contrary to Little Feather's account, wasn't Native. They said Little Feather had constructed her indigenous identity in adulthood to advance her acting career. They produced family records going back to 1850 in which everyone was identified as either white or Mexican. The White Mountain Apache tribe confirmed that they had no enrollment record for Little Feather or any of her ancestors. That story produced a second cycle of reckoning, this one in the opposite direction from the apology a few months earlier. Some commentators called for the Academy to rescind the honor. Others raised concerns about the timing and the method. Little Feather couldn't respond. Her sisters had not come forward during her lifetime. Some Native voices pushed back on Keeler's reporting, citing concerns about her broader project of compiling what she called a pretendian list of suspected fraudulent indigenous claims, and about her methodology. Lenata Warjack, one of the actual organizers of the Alcatraz occupation, said that Little Feather had not been present in Alcatraz, contrary to Little Feather's claims about her own activism. But Warjack also said that what mattered about Little Feather to her was what Little Feather had done at the Oscars, and that the rest could be argued over later. In 2024, a former associate of Little Feather's commissioned an independent genealogical investigation. That investigation produced records suggesting that Little Feather may have had some indigenous ancestry from northern Mexico, possibly the Yaqui. Keeler's response was that indigenous ancestry from Mexico is not the same thing as Native American tribal citizenship, that the legal and political category of Native Americans refers specifically to citizens of federally recognized tribes within the United States, and that Little Feather had never been an enrolled member of any tribe. That is factually where the public record currently sits. What I can tell you is what the documents say. The documents say that Marie Cruz, born in 1946 in Salinas, California, to George Cruz and Geraldine Cooper, became Sacheen Little Feather in adulthood. The documents say that her parents were of Mexican and European descent. The documents say that no tribal nation has enrollment records for her. They also say that in 1973, she did something at the Academy Awards that no one else in the room was prepared to do, and that the work she did afterward at the Bay Area Native community, however her identity was sourced, was work that many people who did it with her continue to vouch for. What I can't tell you is what was in her head, or what she believed about her ancestry, or whether her sister's accounts or her own should be the one we believe, or whether the Academy that apologized for her in 2022 and the Academy that doubted her in 2023 are the same body, making the same kind of mistakes in two opposite directions. The honest answer is that we're still reckoning with this one. The time to give a verdict about Sacheen Little Feather isn't now, while she's dead, and the family's divided, and the journalism is contested. The right thing to do is to hold on to what we know and not pretend to know what we don't. Kaplan, Louisiana. While the country was figuring out what to do with the crying Indian's image, a postdoctoral scholar at UCLA was figuring out what to do with the man himself. Her name is Angela Elise. She's an Italian-American film historian who specializes in the history of Native Americans in Hollywood film. In the early 1990s, she was reading Iron Eyes Cody's 1982 ghost-written autobiography, and the dates and the details weren't adding up. The places he claimed to have been at certain times didn't match the historical record. The Cherokee genealogy he described was not in any of the standard sources. There had been for years a quiet rumor in Hollywood that he wasn't really Indian, but no one was willing to dig. Elise dug. She traced Cody's younger brother Frank through public records. Frank's widow had listed Texas as Frank's birthplace, but Frank's original Social Security application listed Guidon, Louisiana. Elise contacted the librarian of Guidon, who put her in touch with elderly residents who remembered the DeCourty family. One of them was May Abshire, the half-sister, then in her late 70s, living in a retirement home in Louisiana. Abshire confirmed everything. She produced photos. She produced his baptismal records from Holy Rosary Catholic Church in Kaplan. She produced the names of cousins who could verify the story. Elise called Cody at his home in Los Angeles. He was 91 years old at the time, and he'd recently had a stroke. He denied everything, saying, "You can't prove it." He gave her his standard line, "All I know is that I'm just another Indian." He refused to send her any documentation of his Cherokee or Cree ancestry. Elise published her findings in the New Orleans Times-Picayune on May 26, 1996, under the title Native Son. The article laid out the full case: the Sicilian parents, the baptismal record, the half-sister, the brothers who had changed their name from Corti to Cody, the dates, the whole thing. The wire services didn't pick it up. The story remained for several years, mostly known only to people who paid attention to either Native American studies or Hollywood history. Cody continued to insist on his Cherokee identity for the rest of his life. He died on January 4th, 1999, at the age of 94, in the modest Los Angeles home he bought in 1936. He was buried next to Bertha at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. His son Robert, the older of the two boys he and Bertha had adopted, became and remained a respected Native American flutist and powwow dancer. Robert never said publicly that the father he grew up with wasn't Indian. After Cody's death, his estranged son Arthur, who died in 1996, was no longer present to address the question. Robert posted a letter in June 2000 in which he criticized the divisive effect the story was having on the Native community, but stopped short of denying that the story was true. The Native community in Los Angeles that had known Cody best had, in many cases, known for years. The 1995 Lifetime Achievement Honor, which had explicitly named him as non-Native, had been their way of acknowledging both his contribution and his identity without breaking either one publicly. These were people who had every right to call him out and chose not to. They knew exactly what he was, and they gave him grace anyway. The dismissive version of this story leaves that part out. The Indian community in Los Angeles in the 1990s was making a choice about how to handle one of its longtime visible non-members, and the choice they made was more generous than he had earned, and more clear-sighted than the rest of the country was capable of. He died never having recanted, having never apologized, having never named what May Abshire had named. Tonto. You might have thought that what happened to Iron Eyes Cody, the slow exposure in the documentary record and the half-sister and the baptismal certificate, would have ended the practice of casting non-Native actors as Native leads in major Hollywood productions. It did not. It merely slowed it. It made the studios careful about how they talked about it. The practice itself continued. In 2012, Walt Disney Pictures announced that Johnny Depp would be playing Tonto in a forthcoming reboot of The Lone Ranger, directed by Gore Verbinski and produced by Jerry Bruckheimer. The budget was reported at $250 million. Johnny Depp claimed Cherokee and Creek ancestry, but wasn't an enrolled member in any tribe. And the criticism was immediate. Native organizations and Native journalists raised the obvious objection. After more than a century of the same problem, the highest profile Native role in a major studio western was going to a white actor in makeup. How Disney handled it is the part I want to spend a minute on. The studio had, by its own account, courted Native American approval for the casting from the script stage on. They hired a Native cultural advisor. Disney consulted with Native leaders during production, and in the middle of filming in May 2012, an elder named LaDonna Harris, a Comanche, and the founder and president of Americans for Indian Opportunity, formally adopted Johnny Depp into her family in a private ceremony at her home in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The then chairman of the Comanche Nation, Johnny Wakwa, attended the ceremony and recognized the adoption as conferring honorary membership in the Comanche Nation on Johnny Depp. That was a real ceremony, performed by a real Comanche elder and recognized by the Comanche Nation. Harris was clear about her reasoning. She read interviews in which Depp talked about his interest in Native ancestry, and she had decided, in her own words, that it would be a nice thing to do for Mother's Day. She liked him, and I like him. She thought it would be a nice way to honor the work he was about to do, playing a Native lead role. What the studio did with the ceremony is a different question. Disney's publicity used the adoption as a kind of seal of approval. The framing in the press was the Comanche Nation had endorsed Johnny Depp's casting. That wasn't quite what happened. One elder, exercising her own personal authority, had brought Depp into her family. The studio used that personal act as cover for a casting decision the studio had already made for commercial reasons. The film came out in 2013 and it bombed. It lost a ton of money. That's sometimes how the industry resolves things it won't address head on. This is what the practice looks like in the 21st century. It doesn't look like Burt Lancaster and grease paint. It looks like an enormous, expensive production with consultants and ceremonies and goodwill gestures arranged in advance, and a non-native star at the center of that frame. With a press release that quotes a native elder, and the native role in the picture going where it has always gone in pictures like this one. Where it went. The end of the studio system didn't end the rewards for performing Native identity. The rewards moved. They moved out of the soundstage and into the academy and the publishing house and the museum and the foundation, and the people receiving them were no longer character actors with grease paint and wigs. They were professors, writers, activists. The rewards were tenure, grant funding, named chairs, fellowships, and book contracts. The clearest case for me to discuss, because of where I work, is Ward Churchill. Ward Churchill was a professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder from 1990 to 2007. CU Boulder is a separate campus from where I teach, but it's part of the same university system. And what happened with Churchill there is part of the institutional history I'm inside of. His claims shifted over the years. At one point, he was 1/8 Creek and 1/16 Cherokee. At another, 1/16 Creek and Cherokee. Then 3/16 Cherokee. Then an enrolled member of the United Kituwa Band, the Cherokee Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, the United Kituwa Band, all eventually said publicly that he wasn't any of those things. The Kituwa Band clarified that he'd been given an honorary associate membership in the early 1990s, and that this had been granted because he couldn't prove any Cherokee ancestry, that all of his subsequent claims of Kituwa enrollment were considered fraudulent by the tribe. The Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post both conducted independent genealogical investigations that found no evidence of any Native American ancestor in his family tree. CU Boulder hired Churchill into a tenure-track special opportunity position, a category specifically designed to recruit and retain a more diverse faculty. In 1994, the Chancellor of CU Boulder, James Corbridge, was formally presented with allegations from Native leaders that Churchill was falsely claiming Native identity. Corbridge declined to investigate. He said on the record that it had always been university policy that a person's race or ethnicity is self-proving. The complaints were then filed away. In 2001, Churchill wrote an essay arguing that the September 11th attacks were the predictable consequence of decades of American foreign policy. He compared some of the World Trade Center victims to little Eichmanns. The essay went unnoticed for over 3 years. In January 2005, it surfaced in the right-wing press, and it created a national firestorm. The university opened a research misconduct investigation. The investigators looked at his published academic work. They found multiple counts of plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication. They specifically declined to consider the ancestry question, though they acknowledged in their report that Native leaders had been raising it with the university for years and had been ignored. The Board of Regents voted in July 2007 to fire him. The cause given was research misconduct. Whether that firing was about academic misconduct, or about the Eichmann essay, or about the ancestry question, the university wouldn't touch on the record. That's the kind of thing reasonable people argue about. What isn't arguable is that the university hired him into a diversity position in 1990 without verifying his claims, ignored credible complaints from actual Native scholars for 15 years, and then removed him on grounds that conveniently didn't require the university to examine its own failure to do the verification it should have done in the first place. The university protected itself from having to face what it let happen. That's a familiar move. We've seen it before in other institutions with other names. The same shape briefly in other settings. Joseph Boyden is a Canadian novelist whose books about Indigenous protagonists made him one of the most celebrated literary voices in Canada in the 2000s and early 2010s. He claimed Métis, Mi'kmaq, Ojibwe, and Nipmuc ancestry, depending on the year. An investigation report by APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, in late 2016 found that no Indigenous nation could confirm him as kin. His career didn't end, but it did diminish. Carrie Bourassa held a named research chair in Indigenous and Northern Health at the University of Saskatchewan and was a senior figure at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. She claimed Métis, Anishinaabe, and Tlingit ancestry. In 2021, CBC investigation found no documentary evidence of any of it. She was suspended and then resigned. Until that investigation, she spent nearly 2 decades building a major career on the strengths of those claims. Elizabeth Hoover was an associate professor at UC Berkeley, formerly at Brown, who specialized in Native American food sovereignty. She had identified for her entire career as Mohawk and Micmac. In 2022, after years of mounting questions from Native colleagues, she acknowledged that she had no documented connection to either nation. Her eventual apology was long and personal and posted on her own website. The word harm appears in it 13 times. She referred to herself finally as a white person who was raised to believe she was someone else. And then there's Elizabeth Warren, the senior senator from Massachusetts, who for decades claimed Cherokee ancestry on the basis of family stories. In 2018, running for president and trying to put the question behind her, she released the results of a DNA test that found a Native American ancestor somewhere between 6 and 10 generations back. That is the genetic equivalent to trace amounts. The Cherokee Nation issued a sharp statement reminding her that tribal citizenship is not a DNA matter, that no Cherokee citizen would have produced that test as proof of anything, that the gesture had done real harm to actual Native people. She apologized in 2019. The apology did not save her presidential campaign. The story is in the script of this episode because it shows how durable the family lore version of Native ancestry is in white American life, and how much political cover that lore can keep providing right up until the moment someone asks for the documents. The shape repeats. A university gets credit for a diverse hire and declines to verify the claim. When complaints come from people who would know, the university looks away. When the story finally breaks, the university distances itself from the individual and calls itself the victim. The structural conditions that made the deception worthwhile are left in place, available for whoever comes along next. The gravestone. In February 2023, Keep America Beautiful announced that it had transferred ownership of the Crying Indian ad to the National Congress of American Indians. The NCAI said it would restrict the ad's future use to historical analysis. The The image will not be sold again. The tear, that drop of glycerin between takes, has been put away. You can read that in a couple of ways. You can read it as a clean ending. Keep America Beautiful gave back what it had taken. The cultural object was returned to the community it had borrowed from, and the long story closed. Or you can read it as a smaller story than that. Keep America Beautiful is still in business. It's still funded by the same beverage and packaging companies. The argument that pollution is the consumer's fault rather than the manufacturer's is still being made every day in different languages and different formats. Transferring one ad to a native organization 52 years after it first ran doesn't change the system that made the ad worth running. I think both of those readings are true. A few things this episode hasn't been about before we close. It hasn't been about ranking the people in it on a moral scale. It hasn't been about delivering a verdict on Sacheen Littlefeather because we can't deliver one honestly. It hasn't been about flattening Iron Eyes Cody into a one-line punchline, because the man who fabricated his identity for 95 years also raised 2 adopted native sons with a native wife and helped build the Los Angeles Indian Center. It hasn't been about pretending that Long Lance was either a hero who escaped Jim Crow or a fraud who stole what wasn't his, because he was both. And the system that made him choose between those two things was the country he was born into. It hasn't been about treating Ward Churchill as a single bad actor because the University of Colorado was told who he was and decided for 15 years not to know. What it has been about is the way the institution can ask a question, get an answer it doesn't like, and stop asking. Hollywood needed Indians for its westerns and decided not to look closely or care about who was playing them. The advertising industry needed an Indian to weep for the trash on the side of the road and chose a man whose own family had a different story and didn't check. The Academy needed a native presence at the Oscars and got one, and is now into the second decade of trying to figure out which of the 2 contradictory versions to settle on. The universities needed diverse hires for their tenure lines and decided that race is self-proving. Each one of those decisions made sense to the person making it at the time. Each of those decisions is the easy one to make. The hard part would have been hearing the answer. Iron Eyes Cody was a man who put on a costume in a Louisiana town in 1908 and never took it off. The thing he became in that costume was real. The grief that the crying Indians summoned was real. The work Bertha Parker did was real. The land that Long Lance wrote about in Alberta was real. The speech Sacheen Littlefeather gave at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion was real. The reservations and the broken treaties and the boarding schools and the urban relocation programs and the people whose careers and dignities were taken away by men in grease paint are all real. The institutions that built the conditions for it all are real, and most of them are still standing. The man in the canoe was perfect for what the ad needed. He was perfect for what the studio system needed. He was perfect for what the country needed, which was a face that looked Indian enough to carry the emotion without raising any questions that an actual Indian might have raised. That is the trade, and that is what it cost. That's what these systems always want, not the person, the face. These are the questions we ask on Everything is Gray, because nothing about the story is simple, and anyone who tells you it is has already picked which person in the room they care about and stopped asking about anyone else. This episode is dedicated to Bertha Parker. Her gravestone is wrong. I'm Lorne with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode has been written, edited, and produced by Lorne Bregitzer.